when you look back in Western Christianity, I should say, not Eastern Christianity, but Western Christianity, it has been the rediscovery of Paul's letter to the Romans that has brought about the three most significant changes in the history of the church. Beginning with Augustine, then again Luther at the time of the Reformation, and then Karl Barth's commentary on Romans in the end of World War I, the 20th century. We need that fourth rediscovery, and it's happened. It's exciting, and it can change the church if the church will listen. It's already changing the way scholars look at Romans. But as you know, there's a gap of about 100 years between what the scholars are doing out there with regard to their research on the Epistle to the Romans and where life is in the church. There is still a 100-year gap. By the way, just if you want to check this out, observe this. Look at the major questions that plague the church today. Scholarship was dealing with these 100 to 130 years ago. It came up with a lot of the solutions, but Christianity lags so far behind the church, the on the ground, the people in the pews. And there's two reasons. One, our knowledge has grown exponentially. And you know this just in the last 25 years. I don't know what the logarithm is on this, but it's my understanding that for every year that passes now, we are gaining approximately 5 times the knowledge we had the previous year. And this is especially true in areas of technology. As you know, if you bought an iPad last month, it's now a dinosaur. So, but the same thing is true in biblical studies. There has been these absolutely groundbreaking, pioneering works of scholarship that scholars are just going absolute gaga over. Because we are becoming so much more familiar with the ancient world. Biblical scholars, New Testament scholars, are not just stuck in the New Testament anymore. They're reading Jewish literature, they're reading Greek literature, they're reading Latin literature, and they're able to have a context for the biblical writings, and that's especially true of Romans. So let's talk today about Romans. Next week, we're actually going to begin looking at Romans. We're going to do chapters 1 through 3 next week through a very specific lens, a very exciting lens. The following week we're going to engage chapter 5. And I'm just going to walk through that text with you. So if you have a Bible, you might want to bring it, or a notebook, you might want to bring it. You only remember about 10 to 12% of what you hear. That's why we film this. It will be available on audio on the church website. And notes are good. And then the following week we'll do chapters 6 and 7. And then the final week of this class we'll look at Romans 8. And by that time we'll have covered the basic heart of Paul's theology. Here's my goal: to show you as Anabaptists that Paul is your best friend. Now that's a feat, but I'm going to do it. So, who was Paul? Well, there are several things we know about the Apostle Paul, and we need to understand who he was in order to understand, as we move later on into this presentation, why he has the kinds of opponents he has. Because as we'll see, every Pauline letter is written to deal with opponents, even Romans. So the first thing we want to observe about Paul is that Paul is a Shammai Pharisee. There were many kinds of Pharisees in Jesus and Paul's Judaism. Pharisees are not a monolithic group any more than Mennonites are. I believe it was Nelson once told me there are 38 kinds of Mennonites. Well, as far as I know, there were a score of different types of Pharisees. So our tendency is just to lump them together. We see the word Pharisee, we lump them together. But they weren't that way. There were conservative Pharisees, there were liberal Pharisees, and every shade in between. Paul was a Shammai Pharisee. He was trained under Gamaliel II. Gamaliel II was the grandson of Hillel. I don't know if that rings any bells for you, but Hillel was a very liberal rabbi who did most of his work before Jesus lived. And in fact, a good chunk of Jesus' teaching is Hillelite in character. In other words, Jesus would have learned the teachings of Hillel and affirmed many of them, or much of them, I should say. Paul, on the other hand, was a conservative Pharisee. He was a Shemite. But even more than that, he was a zealous conservative Pharisee. He would be the kind of person who gets on the internet today and browbeats people for their worldliness, as it were, if you've ever been on the internet dealing with these kinds of Christians. And a Shemite Pharisee is one who took seriously enough God's injunction to help or make the people of Israel a holy people, even if it meant death to those who were perceived as creating unholiness in the community. That's how far Paul would go. Well, of course, we know this. What does he do in the book of Acts? How do we first encounter him? We encounter him as a killer. That's how we encounter him. He's got letters of authority to kill Christians, and he stands there giving consent to the death of Stephen. And of course, he's trained under Gamaliel II, who's a Shemite. That grandson had left that tradition, he'd be the liberal tradition, he'd become a very conservative Pharisee, and that's Paul's background. Paul is also a Roman citizen. This means he's cosmopolitan. This also means he's aristocratic. It means he has come from a family system that has some wealth, that has social status. Paul is not just a peon. He's not a fisherman. He's not a carpenter. He's a person of means. He knows how to deal with the top dogs in any culture or society. And you will notice on Paul's mission field, when Paul goes to any new territory, he always seeks out people with money and status. That's what he does. In addition to that, he's classically educated. You cannot read Paul's letters and not come away knowing that this particular man has studied deeply in both Greek and Roman educational processes, which include any manner of disciplines, both in what we would call kind of the high school and then the college age level type of things. Paul's rhetoric is intense. His ability to use the kinds, as we'll see just in a bit, to use the kinds of arguments that other great rhetoricians used in order to convince his audience. Paul is also, as I mentioned, aristocratic. So we have all of this as part of this figure's background that we have to take into consideration. Paul is not a dummy. That's what I'm trying to say. Brilliant, educated, well-to-do, is able to take care of himself, and he knows how to play the game. Now, the Pauline letters, when they were written, this is my attempt to do a bit of a, everything starts with a D. What I'm going to say to you is if you really want to understand Paul's letters, you have to first of all understand they were drafted as occasional letters. Paul never sat down to go, I think I'm going to write the Jesus-driven life. He never did that. He wasn't interested in saying, let me leave a legacy of my theology behind. Let me tell people what the Apostle Paul believed. Every letter that Paul writes is an occasional letter. It's written for a specific situation. If you do not understand the situation that the letter was written to, you cannot understand the letter. You just can't lift these letters out of their historical context and go, oh, Jesus, please speak to me. What I want to say is, what I'm saying is there's no such thing as a devotional reading of the Bible anymore in the 21st century. It may have worked in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, but we know better now. And we've watched what that devotional reading of the Bible has wrought in America. It has wrought a Christianity that is completely empire-based, that is militarized. We've seen what happens. We've seen what happens in our own Anabaptist tradition when the Bible is read devotionally through holiness codes and all the kinds of ostracism and scapegoating that go on. That way of reading the Bible has got to be done away with. We have to use our minds. We have to think. And that means recognizing that these texts have a context. And that when we go to the Bible, we have got to do our homework. Second, we have to discern the social context. When Paul writes to Rome, he's writing to different communities and different socialities than he's writing to when he writes in Corinth, or when he writes to Galatia, or when he writes to Philippi. Philippi is a Roman colony. It's pure Gentiles. You ever wonder why Paul never quotes the Hebrew scriptures in Philippi? They wouldn't have had them. He's writing to Romans. I mean, Roman, or Latins, I should say. But when he writes to Rome, he's dealing with two types of Christians. Jewish Christians, and Gentile Christians. And they didn't see eye to eye. They didn't see eye to eye in Galatia. They didn't see eye to eye in Corinth. They didn't see eye to eye in Rome. And this is going to be one of the burdens of Paul's ministry. How do I get Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians to recognize that they're both in Christ? Third, you have to know who Paul's opponents are. He is arguing against somebody in every letter. The opponent in Romans will blow your mind. Because when Paul writes Romans, that opponent is either on his way to Rome or has already arrived. And Paul wants to go to Rome and solicit the support of the Roman house churches in order to continue his mission work on into Spain. And that false teacher's coming to Rome to say, stop this man. Stop his mission work. With me on this? Okay. So we'll look at that in a moment. Third, we have to look, when we deal with any of Paul's letters, whether they were written by Paul. Not all the letters that say, I, Paul, the apostle of Jesus Christ, wrote those letters. There's a phenomenon known as pseudepigrapha in the ancient world. People wrote documents in the names of other famous people. And that's what gave their documents authority. So somebody writing in the name of Paul could pass that off as Paul's, and then we end up with some of these letters in the New Testament. I'll mention them in a moment. Finally, we need to decode the gospel. What is the gospel? I'm going to say this. I'm just going to be bold and up front. Protestant Christianity, which includes Anabaptism in this definition right here and now, has grossly underestimated the gospel and has missed the mark for close to 500 years. We're on the verge of discovering the gospel as Protestants. I need you to think about this. This is very exciting. We're on the verge. When Paul's letters were collected, when were they collected? When did anybody think about collecting Paul's letters? Well, we know that Marcion had collected them in the mid-2nd century. We know that the 7 letters of Ignatius of Antioch were collected in and around the 3rd decade of the 2nd century, perhaps the same time the Pauline letters were. We know that there are 7 letters that were collected to these little house churches that are included in the book of the Revelation in chapters 2 and 3. And interestingly enough, we have 7 recognized Pauline letters by scholars. They include Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. I personally include the Thessalonian correspondence as authentically Pauline. That's me. It's up for big debate in scholarship as to whether 1st and 2nd Thessalonians are Pauline. Ephesians is up for debate. Most critical scholars will argue it's not written by Paul, but by a disciple who really understood Paul. So in other words, what you have in Ephesians is a follower of Paul who got Paul's theology down cold. And that makes that document really valuable. The questionable letters include, as I mentioned, the pastorals. Definitely not written by Paul, in my opinion. I could make a case for that all day long. They're misogynist. Paul is not a misogynist. They're authoritarian and hierarchical in their church structure, whereas Paul is egalitarian. The use of Scripture in the pastorals is fundamentally different than you find in the Pauline letters. You don't find any of the great Pauline vocabulary in the pastorals as you do in these 7 letters. And of course, Hebrews, which even many of the early church fathers who were quite fluent in Greek recognized could not have been written by Paul. So when I talk Paul, I'm talking Romans, the 2 Corinthians letters, Galatians, Philippians, Colossians, Philemon, and I think I mentioned this. The standard approach that you've been taught, that your preachers have preached, that you've heard all of your life to Romans, is that it is a doctrinal letter. That's what you've heard. That's the Lutheran way of reading Paul. When Luther read Paul in 1516, 1517, 1518, as he was discovering his great understanding of what he would term justification by faith, he read the epistle to the Romans in the context of the late Middle Ages. Okay? They have to understand, in the Catholic tradition following Augustine, when Scripture used the phrase dikaiosune, or we in English poorly translated as righteousness, the Catholic tradition translated that in their Vulgate as justificare. We get the word justification from it. And justificare means to make righteous. And so the Catholic Church, from Augustine until Luther, taught that righteousness is something that God makes us through life. We become more and more righteous. And of course that creates a big problem for Luther, because then how can one ever know if one is righteous enough to be accepted by God? And that leads to Luther's great question, where can I find a merciful God? And his discovery then that justification does not mean to make righteous, but to declare righteous. And you get all of that language of, we have our Christ imputed to us, and his righteousness is imputed. All this forensic language that you never find in Paul. But it becomes standard the Protestant lens to read Paul. And for 500 years we've been stuck with this, as though the epistle to the Romans is about each of our individual salvation and how that's accomplished through faith, and how I cannot find my way to God through works, and how I have to believe in all this individual pietistic spiritual reading. Whereas Romans is in fact not about your salvation singular, but about our salvation as a species. And I will detail this particularly in week number 3, which is the last Sunday of this month. So it's not a doctrinal letter. Bob Jewett came out with a massive commentary on Romans some years back, in which he argued the Romans is an ambassadorial letter. It's written to the Roman house churches to get Paul entry into those house churches so that he could move from Rome on to Spain. I think there's great merit in Jewett's way of perceiving the letter. Paul is writing this letter in order to get a foothold in a community he does not know. These are congregations he did not establish. But there are other missionaries going there, trying to make sure that he doesn't get a foothold. We know, as I taught in the last course about the run-up to the 50s, as there's just tremendous aggravation in the ancient world with regard to Judaism. You have any number of problems in Alexandria and Rome, Jews being kicked out of Alexandria, being kicked out of Rome and coming back. You have this mentioned in the book of Acts, of course. You have the troubles in Palestine with all the messianic wannabes and the zealot movement, which is not an official movement, but is an underground kind of an ethos, gains traction in the 50s, and that's going to spill over into the ancient world. And so if you're a Jew living in Rome, what's going to end up happening is you're going to end up thinking back to the homeland, and you're going to become zealous for the homeland, but you're in the heart of the belly of the beast. That's where you, as a Jew, could do real damage. And if you're a Jewish Christian, you can join that. And that's one of the reasons when we come to Romans 13, which we will not do in this class, when Paul says in Romans 13, submit to the powers, the state, he's not making a general ethical case that the state is good. He's trying to forestall Jewish Christians in Rome from ending up taking a militant or a violent position in their defense of the homeland. There's the problem of Gentile-Jewish relations. We know this from all over the New Testament. We know Paul's big, and I've done this with you in several courses here at Akron, Paul's big conflict with the Jerusalem church that is headed up by Peter and James. Remember, this is the deal. The people that lived and walked with Jesus, that talked with Jesus, that would end up being part of that group that passes on the stories that become the Gospels, that group never got Jesus. They always added the law to the message of Jesus. And it's Paul coming in saying, you cannot do that. You don't get Jesus. And when we walked with him, we ate with him, we were his friends. Paul's going, you still don't get it. And the big issue in the early church has to do with Paul versus Jerusalem Christianity. Alien versus predator. I mean, there was no such thing as a unified Christianity, and there never has been. There have always been two churches and two gospels, and one is true and the other is false. The Anabaptists got this in the 16th century. They saw this right off the bat, and that's why they became Anabaptists. Now, in 2 Corinthians, here's what Paul says about his opponents. Since Christ's truth is in me, I won't stop telling the entire area of Greece that I'm proud of what I did. Why? Is it because I don't love you? God knows I do. But I'm going to continue to do what I'm doing. I want to contradict. You hear this language? I want to contradict the claims of the people who want to be treated like they are the same as us because of what they brag about. Such people are false apostles. I want you to hear this. False apostles and dishonest workers who disguise themselves as apostles of Christ. Who's he referring to here? Well, it's easy to go, oh, he's just referring to generic Christians, perhaps some Pharisees that are going out trying to Judaize people. I do believe that an easy and excellent case can be made that he is referring to Peter and to James. He will mention this in Galatians. This is the burden of chapter 2 in Galatians. Peter and James are the problem. The leadership of the church in Jerusalem is the problem, because what they want to do is they want to make sure that anybody that becomes a Christian first becomes a Jew. That's how it works. It's like the Southern Baptists telling you, you got to join our church and be baptized if you want to be a real Christian. Sorry, I'm not a fan of Al Mohler. He says, they disguise themselves as apostles of Christ, and no wonder even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. I don't know if you understand how powerful this rhetoric is. Paul is putting Jerusalem Christianity on the side of the Satan. This is big stuff, folks. This is a gulf, it's a gap, it's an abyss, it's a chasm. It cannot be crossed, Paul says. You're either this or you're that. So he says, it's no great surprise that his servants will disguise themselves as servants of dikaiosune, righteousness, holiness. And we know that's exactly what the Jerusalem church was doing, going up. We've got to make sure that Joy does the kosher meal thing. We've got to make sure she worships. We've got to turn her into a Jew before she could be a Christian. And that was Paul's problem. We see the same thing in Galatians. In chapter 4, he says, have I become your enemy by telling you the truth? They, that is, whoever his opponents are in Galatians, which I believe are the same as they are in Romans, and the same as they are in Corinth, and the same as they are in Philippi, are so concerned about you, though not with good intentions. Now here's Paul saying right off the bat, that the disturbers that have come into his Galatian congregations do not have good intentions. They want to shut you out so you would run after them. Chapter 5, it gets even better. It says, I wish that the ones who are upsetting you would castrate themselves. You have to understand this in the Greek text, what's going on. Remember, the Peter James Jerusalem church want Gentiles to get circumcised, removing the foreskin of the penis. That's what they want. Paul says here, I wish they would cut their dicks off. You understand that? This is the rhetoric that's being used here. Forget just the tip, cut the whole thing off. This is Paul. In your face, Paul. In chapter 6, whoever wants to look good will try to get you to be circumcised, but only so they won't be harassed for the cross of Christ. Because from Paul's perspective, the cross of Christ, the death of Christ, does something to religion. It kills it. Kills religious practice. Jesus' death is the end of religion. This is a Pauline theme. Those who are circumcised don't observe the whole law themselves, but they want you to be circumcised so they can boast about how many converts they made. We got X, Y, and Z. It's like the Southern Baptist, or any church that has the denomination say, what are your statistics? How many did you baptize this year? How many new members did you take in? Yada, yada, yada. The false teacher comes to Rome. Now, I'm not going to put a name to this false teacher. I'll let you do that. I've had some conversations with some of the top scholars on this business. I've made my guess. And when I made my guess, the one person, Douglas Campbell, who wrote the book on the subject, said, now that's the $64,000 question as to who this false teacher is. But the thing you have to do to understand Romans is to recognize several things. When you get to chapters 2 through 4, and you already know this from reading Romans, if you've ever read Romans, Paul uses a rhetorical device called diatribe. He says, some will say, and then he says what he thinks the opponent would say. And then he rebuts it. Some will say, some will say, someone might say. In other words, he's using a form of rhetoric to show the opponent's position and his argument against that position. Do you understand what I'm saying so far about diatribe? This week, if you really want to get handles on this, go look at Romans 2 through 4. And in some Bible you don't use much, take a pen or pencil and try and figure out which sections are Paul and which sections are the false teacher. Because we're going to actually do that exercise next week. But here's the thing. Paul begins his letter by talking about the dikaiosune theou in Romans 1:16 and 17. And we'll look at this text again next week, but he says that he is a preacher of the justification of God. The big question that the epistle to the Romans asks and answers is this: how do you justify a God who forgives everybody freely? How do you justify a God who shows mercy on all? What kind of a God is that? That's the question that Paul's wrestling with in Romans. That's the problem that he's dealing with the Jewish Christians who want to make sure that there's all these holiness codes, all these rules and regulations, all these cultural morals that are brought into the Christian world, they're Jewish in nature at that time, in order to make Christians. How do you justify a God who doesn't care about those things? How do you justify a God that loves both Mother Teresa and Adolf Hitler? How do you do that? How do you justify a God that loves both George Bush and Osama bin Laden? How do you do that? How do you do that? That's the problem that Paul's having to deal with. And so he's going to use a strategy. And that strategy is known in Greek as prosopopoia. That's not, yes it is, there it is, right there. Prosopopoia. Prosopopoia is a rhetorical device where you intentionally either quote or paraphrase your opponent. You're going to set out what they believe because you're going to rebut it, you're going to refute it. And what Douglas Campbell has brought to the table And what Ben Witherington has also recognized is that Romans 1:18-32, that great anti-homosexual clobber passage, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven, yada, 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 because they became gay, right? That passage is not Paul. That passage is the false teacher. It's that logic, 1:18-32, that Paul is going to critique in chapters 2-4. Now, when you go read Romans 1-4 this week, and I encourage you to do it, read chapter 1, verses 18-32 as the false teacher. This is what the false teacher believes. And by the way, that rhetoric of Romans 1:18-32, if you have an apocrypha, you know what the apocrypha is, right? There's a book in there called the Wisdom of Solomon. Most of Romans 1:18-32 is lifted from the Wisdom of Solomon. It was a popular piece of anti-Gentile rhetoric. It's standard Jewish anti-Gentile rhetoric that's being used in 1:18-32. It's like when the Republicans criticize Obama, they have their standard rhetoric, right? He's not born here. He's a liberal. He's going to make us communist. He's a socialist. They have their standard rhetoric, and they repeat it, so that if they repeat it often enough, people will believe it. In the same way, Judaism had its standard anti-Gentile rhetoric. And so if you compare Romans 1:18-32 with Wisdom of Solomon, particularly the latter half of the book, you'll see most of what's in Romans 1:18-32 is already in the Wisdom of Solomon, which was written, again, long before Romans. Paul will also use this particular form of rhetoric in chapters 9-11. If you've ever read chapter 9-11 of Romans on election, I don't know if you've ever wasted your time doing that, or tried to do that, you come away with Paul as some kind of mentally disturbed person, speaking out of both sides of his mouth about election. And it makes no sense until you recognize that a good chunk of chapter 9 is prosopopoia. This is the false teacher's position that chapters 10 and 11 are going to argue against. The same thing goes on in parts of chapters 12-15 as well. And this is why when Paul sent letters out, he just didn't give them to the local person that was heading off on the ship to some far-off distant port to eventually get to his house churches. He always sent a letter carrier. I'm sending this letter with Timothy. I'm sending this letter with Epaphroditus. I'm sending this letter with Titus. I'm sending this... In other words, he's always sending someone that will read that letter. Remember, literacy rates in the ancient world? Tops 8-10%. Tops. Most people can't read. So he sends a letter reader with his letters so that when that letter is read to the house churches, that letter reader knows when to change the tone of voice. So that the congregation knows when the opponent is being quoted or paraphrased and when Paul is speaking. In other words, the letter reader is an actor. So, if I'm reading Romans, I can say, the righteousness of God is given from faith to faith. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven, Paul. And I would change voice. And you would know in the change of voice that it's not Paul speaking. It's the opponent. And you can do this as you read chapters 2-4. Don't read them out loud, but change your voice, change the way you inflect things, and you will see that going all throughout that letter. Why is this important? Because by understanding Paul's use of ancient Greek rhetorical constructs, we are able to really discern the big difference between the false gospel of Jerusalem Christianity and Paul's gospel. It's when we blur the voices and assume that they're all Paul, that we end up with a Paul that makes no sense. You ladies know from 1 Corinthians 14, where you have that whole thing about let women be silent in the churches and all that. That's not Paul. He's quoting the opponents. And that's why he says, do you think the Word of God came only to you? When he's finished with that little section about women should be silent in the churches. Man, he nails the Corinthians. Bang, right on the head with a sledgehammer.
This is encouraging.
It is. Because what it means is Paul's not a misogynist. But we've turned him into that because we read his letters flat. Rather than seeing them in 3D, HD, supersonic sound. We need to put them back in their context. And when we do, not only does Paul emerge as a champion of the gospel, but the gospel is such good news because the gospel's about all of us, and because it's about all of us, it's about each of us. You see that? But it's first about all of us. It's first about all of us. Protestantism and Anabaptism flip that. It's about each of us. And so we've got our little doctrine of hell at the end of our theology. I was just on the phone yesterday for an hour and a half with a young man from Michigan who said to me, quote, I can't have a gospel without hell. And I said to him, then how is your gospel good news? If you have to have a vision of God torturing people in some eternal Guantanamo Bay in order to be able to say, you better accept Jesus Christ into your heart or you're going to burn, baby. What is the good news about that? There is no good news in that at all. Basically what you're saying is, turn or burn. Do it my way or it's the highway. And what kind of a God is that? Is that the God that Jesus called Papa? No. Is that the God that Paul encounters on the road to Damascus? Is this the God of the gospel? Absolutely not. But Protestantism has gummed up the works. And, for the record, the Mennonites have bought into the Protestant message and have gummed up the works now for 500 years. It's time to clear the tables. I'm saying this to Akron Mennonite. I'm saying this to every church I go to. Clear the crap off the tables. Let's take the best education we have out there, the best scholarship we have out there right now, and let's work with that. And let's figure out who we are in the light of the good gospel, of the good God, of the Father, of the Son, of the Spirit. Let's figure out what it means to be church like the Trinity is community. Let's figure out what it means to be accepting, embracing, loving, forgiving, even of enemy others. Let's learn what it means to turn the other cheek. Let's not toss out the ethic of the Sermon on the Mount for expediency in order to be a good citizen. Let's find out what it really means to carry the cross and to hope for the resurrection. Let's do this. Clear the tables, folks. That's what the next 4 weeks is about. Okay, right? By the way, let me know when you're ready. Sorry? So here's where we're going. Paul's theology, folks, does not begin until chapter 5. When you read Romans. He's not going to even tell you what he believes is the gospel till he gets to chapter 5. He's just dealing with all the garbage of the opponents in chapters 1 through 4. He's clearing the table. In chapter 5 through 8, he's going to tell you what his theology is. Notice focus. The Father sends the Son and the Spirit. It is the Father that takes the initiative in salvation. We live between the times, Paul says. We live both in this age, and yet the age to come has already begun breaking in with the resurrection of Jesus. There's the radical challenge of Paul's gospel, but there's especially in Romans 5 through 8 a new sociology that's being given that says all this business that separates the Jew from the Gentile, that is Torah, law, rules, social mores, all of that's gone. There's nothing that can separate us from the love of God, and nothing can separate us from each other. Nothing. Because we're all included in Jesus Christ. Period. End of story. That's Paul's gospel. That's what we're going to get to. Okay, now you.